Josephus talks about Jesus in ways that remarkably parallel the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John. He puts Jesus under the reign of Pontius Pilate, the governorship of Pontius Pilate. While Caiaphas was high priest, he says he had many disciples. He says that he worked miracles, providing that we understand that word with the appropriate suspicion that Josephus accords to it. He provides fantastic light on the Jesus of history.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Tyndale House's podcast. And we have a really special episode today. My name is Peter Williams. I'm the principal at Tyndale House, and I have a special guest, Professor and Dr. Thomas C. Schmidt. And he's going to be talking about a very remarkable book that he is bringing out, or just come out, and we're looking forward to conversation together. So, and we're going to have 2 episodes on this topic. So, just to introduce my guest, Tom, you've got a new book out on Josephus and Jesus, which I think is quite groundbreaking, and it's making the claim that Josephus knew people who were actually at Jesus's trial, and that's really stunning, and we're going to go into that. But before we go into that, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your academic journey?
Thank you, Peter. I guess I could start in the beginning. I was raised in a Christian family. I didn't become a Christian, though, until my first year in college. And there, I fell in love with the New Testament. I couldn't get enough of it. Night after night, page after page, I kept reading it. And pretty soon, I wanted to read it in its original language. So I started taking Greek classes. I had already signed up for some Latin classes. Before I knew it, I was majoring in Latin and Greek. That's what I took my degree in. And when I graduated, I married my wife, and then I taught Greek and Latin and a little bit of Greek in the public schools for a couple of years, did some other things. And after a while, I found myself in Yale's PhD program.
Like you do,
yeah. And there, I studied Christian history. I did a lot of philological work, studied several languages. I was there for about 7 years. Graduated. Ever since, I've been a professor at Fairfield University. That's a school in Southern Connecticut. And just last month, I was notified I've been awarded tenure there. And then next year, I'll be on leave. I'll be a visiting fellow at Princeton University in the James Madison program, where I'll be looking at the history of Christian persecution in Persia. But
wow.
my interests are they're all over the place. I love Eastern Christianity, Christianity in Central Asia, Syriac context, Arabic context. But I also love the early church, Christian commentaries, early Christian writers. But, one of my chief delights is New Testament studies, canonical development of the New Testament, and of course, the study of the historical Jesus. That's what my book is about, Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ. And may I just say, Peter, that throughout my career, Tyndale House has been an enormous blessing for me. The quality of scholarship coming out of it has been fantastic. Truly, Tyndale is worthy of its name. So I thank you and so many other people there.
Well, that's great. And I can brag on your behalf. Not only do you read Greek and Latin, but also Hebrew and Syriac and Armenian and Coptic and Arabic and some more.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah. You're going to be modest about it. So let's dive into this book. So it's with Oxford University Press. I think I've heard of them. And to give it the full title, it's Josephus and Jesus: New Evidence for the One Called Christ. And a lot of it is about a particular mention that Josephus makes of Jesus. But first, we need to ask ourselves the question, who is Josephus? So maybe you can just give us a little bit of an idea of who this guy was.
Yeah, he's mostly known by most people as a first century Jewish historian. But his background is actually much more complicated. He was born in Jerusalem in 37 AD. He was raised in an eminent priestly family. He was also of royal descent. He became a Pharisee when he was 19 years old. When he was 20 or 25, he became a priest. When he was 30, he was appointed one of the top generals in the Jewish army against Rome. And then after the Jewish army's defeat, he turned for the last 20, 30 years of his life to writing history. And we know him now as a historian, but he was Pharisee, priest, general, and historian. And his works are of great significance. He's probably the most important extra biblical source on New Testament times. And so, you read his works and New Testament figures just pour off the pages. Pontius Pilate, Caiaphas, Herodias, Herod the Great. They're all mentioned by Josephus and discussed. So he's invaluable for that and invaluable for the study of early Judaism also.
And just take us really briefly through his major works or the things that he's known for having written.
Yeah, he wrote 4 books, not nearly of equal length. He wrote a short autobiography. He wrote a relatively short apology for Judaism called Against Appian. But his 2 major works is The Wars of the Jews, which talks about the Jewish war with Rome in 66 to 70 AD. And then his Antiquities, where he begins from creation and traces Jewish history all the way up to right before the Jewish war in 66 AD. And he overlaps, some of these works overlap. He'll talk about the same events several times. So he wrote 500,000 words almost. So it can be intimidating to dip in. But if your listeners are interested, start with Book 18 of the Antiquities, where he talks about the governorship of Pontius Pilate. Read Book 5 or 6.
Got it right here. Book 18, right here.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're going to have to dive into Book 18. So just to give it some context, there are 20 books of the Antiquities, which is his particularly big work. And we got 2 mentions of Jesus in that. And I'm just going to read one of them. And this is what your passage, your book is particularly about, where this is what the text says, and obviously it's in Greek. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, indeed, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. When Pilate, upon hearing him, accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the 3rd day he appeared to them, restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him, and a tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Now that's a standard translation. You've got your own translation that's going to be a little bit different from that at points. But as you can see, here we've got major Jewish historian to our reading today saying he's the Christ, and yet we know Josephus doesn't become a Christian. Therefore, people say, hey, this passage is probably suspect. And you have got a claim, basically, that the passage can be understood to be entirely from Josephus, and the second, startling claim that Josephus had a relationship or knew well people who are actually at Jesus's trial, and we're going to go into that particularly in the second episode, because just to put that together, I mean, this is obviously the main things we have about Jesus' trial are the 4 Gospels, and now along comes Dr. Schmidt and is saying that we have another angle in on that, which is rather remarkable, and I'm sure people will want to contest that claim. But maybe you could just take us through how we should understand this passage and what brought you to the conclusion that it's authentic. Obviously, there's some people deny it's from Josephus. The whole lot's been put in. Some say he said bits, but not this line and that line. Didn't say he was the Messiah, for instance, or appeared on the 3rd day. How do you come to that? And maybe talk us how you came to these conclusions.
I'll start off by saying that when I was writing this book, when I first started, I agreed with the general scholarly consensus that this passage had been contaminated by Christian scribes at a later point. It's your translation that you read. I mean, it sounds way too pro-Christian, radically in favor of Jesus to have written by a non-Christian. And that's what I believed. But I started looking at how ancient Greek writers treated the passage. How did they quote it? How did they comment on it? And I started noticing in case after case after case that these ancient and medieval Greek writers, where Greek was their native language, they didn't seem to be reading it in the same way that modern scholars are reading it. They have the same text before them, but they don't think of it as this amazingly pro-Christian passage. Some of them even seemed to think it was a little negative towards Jesus, or could be construed that way. So that got my curiosity going. And I decided to do as comprehensive a study as I could of the language in the passage to see if the language, the turns of phrase, the grammar, if all that was used by Josephus elsewhere, or if it wasn't, if it's a non-Josephine style. And I found, using some Greek databases, that Josephus's style just drips off the pages. Every turn of phrase, every grammatical construction, the word frequency levels, they all are comparable to Josephus. You can find just a flood of parallels throughout Josephus's work. So in other words, it looks like the style of Josephus. The phrases are used by him elsewhere many times. And what's interesting is that if you look at how Josephus uses the same words and phrases elsewhere, you see that these phrases aren't as positive as scholars have traditionally considered them to be. And sometimes they're even negative. And that explains why those Greek writers were reading the passage differently, because they knew the Greek language, they knew these words are a bit more ambiguous. So I propose, I think, a well-calibrated translation that considers how Josephus uses these phrases elsewhere. And the passage doesn't come across as nearly positive about Jesus, and it actually can be a bit negative about him as well.
Okay, so let's go into that. One of the things I was fascinated by in your book, and just remind me how many pages your book is in print.
Yeah, I think it's 330. I think.
Okay, so it's a substantial book. Is you've got a table of word frequency where obviously there are 89 words in the standard Greek text of this passage, and the rarest word, or the word that doesn't occur in Josephus elsewhere, is the word Christian. And then in a sense you dial up from there to the more frequent words, and we'll actually talk about some of those specific words. But basically you're finding there's a correlation where the rare words within the language more generally are rarer in Josephus, but the ones that are most frequent in the passage also correspond pretty amazingly with frequency that he has within his own writings. And perhaps if we could even name some Greek words with that, and you could just talk us through that so that people can see your argument in a bit more depth.
Yeah, one of the criticisms of the passage by previous scholars was that there's some words in the passage that are rare in Josephus. He has a massive corpus of almost 500,000 words. So we have a great sample size of how Josephus liked to deploy certain vocabulary items. And this passage has several words that are rare. One word that's even unique. He doesn't use it anywhere else. And those were previously thought of markers of inauthenticity, that this is indicators that Christians had interpolated the passage. But what I show is when you rank all his vocabulary and you look at how frequently he will use rare words, it turns out that he has this enormous vocabulary. I mean, it's just astonishing how large his vocabulary is, to the point that he uses a unique word. So he deploys a word he doesn't use anywhere else in 500,000 words. He deploys a unique word about every 87 words. And the passage is 89 or 90 words long. So you would expect him to use a unique word. And that's just what he does.
Beautiful,
and of course, he does use a unique word. The unique word happens to be the word Christian. So what other word would you expect he uses when he's talking about Jesus, who is called the Christ? And I show that frequency rate, I show that it's the same in a passage. In other words, that if we took a random passage of 90 words of similar length elsewhere, we would find the same amount of rare words, the same number of common words. Common words aren't used too frequently. Rare words aren't used too infrequently. It all matches. And the field of forensic authorship analysis has been doing this kind of thing for years. And what this shows is that really there's nothing, in terms of the use of vocabulary, there's nothing in the passage that is odd. It all looks Josephine in terms of frequency level.
Now, your book available from Oxford University Press, hard copy, but also available electronically. And how does one get it electronically?
There was an anonymous donor approached me and wanted to make the book available for free. So it's available for free online at josephusandjesus.com. It'll be up there by midsummer. And you can also buy a hardcover copy. It's academic pricing, so it'll be quite expensive. But please avail yourself of the free copy at josephusandjesus.com.
Well, that's really great. So people can follow you, get down into the detail, and then this other thing about the passage not being as Christian as it sounds to us. So can we go into that? Because obviously there is the fact that Josephus uses the word Christ of him and talks about appearances on the third day. Maybe you can take us into those and anything else that you think's worthwhile where people have found it to be a particularly Christian sounding passage.
Yeah, right. So the two major criticisms are that it doesn't have Josephus's style. We've talked about that already. I don't think that's a valid criticism. But the second is that the claims of the passage don't sound like they come from a non-Christian. When you do a close reading of the Greek text, though, those phrases that in your translation sounded like they come from a Christian, that Jesus appeared alive on the third day, that he worked these, I think your translation said astounding or amazing feats or something like that.
Yeah, marvelous, yeah.
Marvelous. You see that actually these passages suggest other interpretations. That word for marvelous feats is the Greek word paradoxa. And this Greek has a very rich vocabulary. They have many words for miracles, and paradoxa is one that's used for where you've got some kind of questions about that. And I think the questions are more, moral questions. Where is this power coming from? It's a little uncertain. Josephus uses that same word to describe the miracles of Pharaoh's magicians, for instance, and that passage also has other parallels with the paragraph on Jesus. So that's one example where in English this sounds really positive, in Greek not so much. Another example with the resurrection is just a simple grammatical observation that the Greek word phainomai can mean appear, which is what Josephus uses. He appeared to them alive. It can also mean seem, like he seemed to them to be alive, or he appeared to them to be alive. In other words, with that understanding, the passage is just saying that the disciples thought Jesus was alive on the third day, which is something that non-Christians could freely admit. And I show that the grammatical structure of that sentence is used by Josephus elsewhere. And in that same structure, he clearly means seem. He doesn't mean definitely appeared physically. So, and that I think is how early Greek writers read the passage, because many of them don't seem to think it confesses the resurrection. And there's a number of observations I make that alter the understanding of the passage so that, and I think it calibrates it to Josephus's style much more closely. And the passage then doesn't come across as too Christian sounding. You mentioned Christ, right? Yeah. So that's another big one where he says he was the Christ. And of course, if you're a first century Jew and you say Jesus is the Christ, then you're also a Christian. You can't really, that's what a Christian is you confess Jesus is the Christ. But that's what the Greek textual witnesses say. But there's an early Latin translation, and there's an early Syriac translation. There's also an Arabic translation that's a second-tier witness. And these are united, the Latin and the Syriac are united, and they don't say that Jesus is the Christ or was the Christ. They say he was thought to be the Christ, or he was believed to be the Christ. And these translations are not copying off of one another. They clearly are independently going back to Greek manuscripts. So I think that is our original reading. This also happens to match how Josephus talks about Jesus elsewhere. In his one other reference to Jesus where he says he was called the Christ, the Latin and Syriac match that, where they say he was thought to be or somehow considered to be the Christ. So with that understanding, it's, again, he's just communicating what people called Jesus.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's really remarkable. And so what does that make you think then overall about the significance of Josephus, his testimony about Jesus, as we understand it today?
I think it means that Josephus talks about Jesus in ways that remarkably parallel the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John. He puts Jesus under the reign of Pontius Pilate, the governorship of Pontius Pilate. While Caiaphas was high priest, he says he had many disciples. He says that he worked miracles, providing that we understand that word with, the appropriate suspicion that Josephus accords to it, the moral suspicion. But that agrees with the gospel accounts. The Jewish leaders, they did think he'd worked miracles. They just thought that he was using Beelzebub or something like that. He affirms the apostles, the disciples, did believe Jesus was resurrected on the third day, that this wasn't something that developed decades or generations later. This was a very early Christian belief that Josephus acknowledges. And so I think that he provides fantastic light on the Jesus of history.
Now, what will people reply to your book? Obviously, it's early days. You've got some great commendations from serious scholars for your work. But everything is contested. So scholars are going to come back at you. What do you think are the strongest points they could make against your argument?
When I've presented at conferences on this, they've brought up the thing that has brought up several times is that it's not the style of the passage, it's not the content of the passage, it's the position of the passage, that the passage just doesn't fit in the antiquities where it's located. It looks like it's been inserted. And I do address that in the book. I think it actually fits remarkably well. Mm-hmm. It matches some Jewish traditions. There's adjacent stories that Jewish traditions about Jesus show how the story fits in with those two passages and so forth. I think that's one thing that people will use. I think another is that it's going to be hard for people to unlearn how to see a passage. They're so used to seeing translated in this wildly pro-Christian way. And I offer a translation that I think is much fairer to it. Mm-hmm. And I think that people are going to, they might struggle with that. They're also going to struggle with, I've heard this several times also, that people will say, he should have said more about Jesus. He should have said more. Why did he only say 90 words? He should have had pages and pages about Jesus. To which, I would say, it sounds like you're talking like a 21st century person who's more interested in Jesus than Josephus was. He would have had ample reason to say what he did. He's writing at a time when the Jewish people are divided about Jesus. There's a lot of uncertainty about who he is. So he would have had many reasons to not try and stir up a hornet's nest or to say something briefly. Christianity was controversial to the Greco-Romans as well, and there's part of his audience. So there's many reasons why he may not have wanted to dwell over much on Jesus.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, in the next episode, we're going to go a little bit more into the chronology, particularly of Josephus and his relationship with Jesus. I think we're going to, of course, see the Josephus is born after the time of the events of Jesus' ministry. So that's something just need to make clear. So he's close from one perspective, but he's not an eyewitness himself. But we're going to see in the next episode that he knew people who did meet Jesus. So very, very grateful to Tom Schmidt for making his time available. I encourage you to go to his website, and maybe you could just give us the URL for that as we end and to see that.
Yes, it's josephusandjesus.com.
Josephus and Jesus.com, and there you can see more about the book. And of course, you should follow our own Tinner House podcast, rate, review, and share widely. And this particular story is really worth sharing widely. So thank you very much, Tom, and looking forward to the next episode.